What if one of the greatest drummers who ever lived had the chance to sit across from the woman now carrying one of the hardest jobs in rock music? Imagine the scene. A quiet rehearsal room somewhere in Canada, drumsticks resting on a snare, cymbals glowing under soft lights. On one side sits Neil Peart, the architect of Rush's legendary sound, the man whose drumming inspired generations. On the other side sits Anika Nilles, the modern virtuoso chosen decades later to help bring Rush's music back to the stage. The meeting never happened. Neil Peart passed away in January 2020, leaving behind a legacy that many believed could never be touched. For years afterward, fans assumed Rush's story had ended forever. Then something unexpected happened. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson slowly found their way back to performing, and eventually they chose German drummer Anika Nilles to join them for the 50-something tour. The announcement immediately sparked one huge question among fans. What would Neil have thought? Not because anyone can replace him. Even Geddy Lee has repeatedly emphasized that Neil was irreplaceable. In fact, Lee admitted that stepping into that role would always invite comparisons to the man. But this isn't really a story about replacement. It's a story about respect. Because when you look closely at Anika Nilles playing, you begin to notice something fascinating. She doesn't sound like Neil Peart. She never tried to. Yet some of the qualities that made Neil extraordinary seem to appear in her approach to music. Both drummers share a deep obsession with precision. Both treat rhythm like a language instead of a simple beat. And both seem to believe that drums should do more than keep time. They should tell a story. That is where this analysis begins. Before we compare their techniques, fills, and musical philosophies, we need to understand why Anika Nilles was chosen in the first place. The answer wasn't fame. It wasn't popularity. And surprisingly, according to Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, she wasn't even a lifelong Rush fan. Yet after a series of rehearsals and auditions, something clicked. The Rush legends realized she possessed a rare combination of technical mastery, musical intelligence, and adaptability. By the final sessions, they knew they had found the drummer capable of honoring the music while still bringing her own identity to it. But here's where things get really interesting. The very qualities that convinced Geddy and Alex may be the same qualities Neil Peart himself would have admired. And once we start breaking down their drumming styles side by side, the similarities become impossible to ignore. If Neil Peart had walked into one of those rehearsals, the first thing he probably would have noticed wasn't Anika Nilles' speed. It wasn't her flashy fills. And it certainly wasn't how many notes she could squeeze into a measure. It would have been her musical discipline. That's because Neil spent his entire career proving that great drumming isn't about playing more notes. It's about playing the right notes. Many fans remember Neil for his massive drum solos and jaw-dropping technical ability, but musicians often point to something else, his ability to serve the song. Whether Rush was playing a 7-minute progressive epic or a radio hit, every drum part had a purpose. Interestingly, Anika approaches music in a very similar way. Long before she became associated with Rush, she earned respect in the drumming world through videos that showcased not just technical skill, but creative phrasing. Her grooves often feel less like exercises and more like conversations. Every accent, ghost note, and cymbal hit seems carefully placed. That kind of thinking would have immediately caught Neil's attention, because Neil wasn't just a drummer. He was an architect. He designed drum parts the way a writer constructs a story. There was always a beginning, a build-up, and a payoff. Listen to classic Rush recordings, and you'll hear drums that guide the listener through complex arrangements without ever losing direction. Anika does something remarkably similar, though in a modern way. Where Neil often built tension through powerful tom patterns and dramatic dynamics, Anika frequently creates movement through subtle rhythmic shifts and unexpected accents. Different tools, same goal, keeping the listener engaged. And that's where this comparison becomes fascinating. On the surface, they come from completely different generations. Neil's style was shaped by progressive rock giants of the 1970s. His influences included jazz, big band music, and progressive pioneers who pushed rock beyond traditional boundaries. Anika grew up in a different musical world entirely. Her influences include modern fusion, contemporary groove music, and advanced rhythmic concepts that became popular decades after Rush first emerged. Yet, despite those differences, both drummers arrived at a similar destination. They refused to play predictably. That's one reason Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson reportedly found rehearsing with Anika so exciting. She wasn't trying to imitate Neil note for note. Instead, she brought fresh energy while preserving the spirit of the music. And that raises an important question. Would Neil have wanted a copy of himself behind the drums, or would he have preferred someone capable of bringing something new? When you look at Neil's entire career, the answer becomes surprisingly clear. He spent decades evolving. He studied jazz later in life. He rebuilt parts of his technique. He constantly searched for new ideas rather than repeating old ones. In many ways, growth became one of his defining characteristics, which means the drummer most likely to earn his respect wouldn't necessarily be the one who sounded exactly like Neil Peart. It would be the one brave enough to sound like herself, and that may be where Anika Nilles made her strongest case. But technical skill and musical intelligence are only part of the story. Because the deeper we examine their drumming philosophies, the more we uncover a connection that goes far beyond sticks, cymbals, and drum kits. The deeper you dig into Neil Peart and Anika Nilles, the more you realize this comparison isn't really about drumming. It's about mindset. Because what separated Neil from thousands of talented drummers wasn't simply his technique. Plenty of drummers can play fast. Plenty can memorize complex patterns. What made Neil different was his relentless pursuit of improvement. Even after becoming one of the most respected drummers in the world, he never acted as though he had mastered the instrument. Instead, he continued studying, practicing, and challenging himself. That mentality became legendary. In the 1990s, after already achieving global fame with Rush, Neil made the surprising decision to essentially rebuild parts of his drumming technique from the ground up. Under the guidance of jazz teacher Freddie Gruber, he began rethinking movements, posture, and musical expression. Think about that for a moment. A drummer who had already sold millions of records was willing to become a student again. That level of humility is rare, and it's one of the reasons so many musicians admired him. Now fast forward to Anika Nilles. One of the most striking things about her career is that she never became known simply for copying others. Instead, she developed her own voice through years of experimentation, practice, and study. Watch interviews with Anika, and you'll often hear her discussing rhythm as a constantly evolving journey. She approaches music with curiosity rather than certainty. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly how many people describe Neil. Neither drummer seemed interested in proving they were the best. They seemed more interested in discovering what was possible. And that shared philosophy may be the strongest connection between them. Imagine Neil watching Anika perform one of Rush's most challenging songs. He probably wouldn't be counting every note. He wouldn't be sitting there asking whether a fill matched a recording from 1981. Instead, he'd likely be looking for something deeper. Is the music alive? Is the drummer listening? Is she bringing honesty to the performance? Those questions mattered enormously to Neil throughout his career, and they may explain why so many fans who were initially skeptical eventually warmed to Anika's role in Rush's return, because they began noticing something important. She wasn't approaching the music as a museum piece. She was approaching it as a living, breathing performance. That requires courage. After all, every time she sits behind those drums, she knows millions of Rush fans are comparing her to one of the greatest drummers who ever lived. That's pressure most musicians could hardly imagine. Yet she continues stepping onto the stage and delivering performances that honor the material while remaining authentic to who she is. Ironically, that kind of confidence mixed with humility might be exactly what Neil would have respected most. But there's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked, a layer that has nothing to do with technique, philosophy, or musical education. It's about emotion. And once we explore the emotional side of drumming, the question of what Neil might have thought about Anika becomes even more fascinating. For all the talk about technique, odd time signatures, and impossible drum fills, there was always something deeply emotional at the heart of Neil Peart's playing. Many people who never picked up a pair of drumsticks could still feel it. They might not have understood why a particular fill sounded powerful. They might not have known the difference between 7/8 and 4/4 time, but they could feel the emotion flowing through the music. That was one of Neil's greatest gifts. His drumming wasn't just mechanical precision. It was storytelling. Every crash cymbal, every tom run, every carefully placed accent seemed connected to the emotion of the song. Whether Rush was performing a hopeful anthem, a reflective ballad, or an epic progressive rock journey, Neil's drumming helped shape the emotional landscape. And that's where Anika Nilles enters the conversation in a very interesting way. Because despite her incredible technical ability, many drummers admire her most for her feel. Feel is difficult to define. You can't measure it with a stopwatch. You can't calculate it with mathematics. It's that mysterious quality that makes a groove feel human. It's the reason two drummers can play the exact same pattern, and yet one performance feels more alive than the other. Anika possesses that quality in abundance. Even in her most complex performances, there's a sense of musical conversation taking place. Her drumming breathes, it moves, it reacts. And that's important, because Rush's music has always demanded more than technical accuracy. The songs require emotion. Take away the emotional connection, and even the most perfect performance can feel empty. That's why so many musicians say that honoring Neil's legacy isn't about reproducing every note exactly as he played it. It's about capturing the spirit behind those notes. And that's a much harder challenge. Imagine Anika sitting at a drum kit while Neil quietly watches from across the room. She begins playing. The fills are different. Some accents aren't exactly where Neil might have placed them. Certain transitions reflect her own personality. Yet the energy is there. The commitment is there. The emotional truth is there. Would Neil stop her and demand imitation? Or would he recognize something every great musician understands? That authenticity matters more than replication. Because throughout his own career, Neil constantly evolved. The drummer who recorded Rush albums in the 1970s wasn't the same drummer who played in the 1990s or the 2010s. His style changed, matured, and expanded over time. Growth was part of his identity, and that makes one possibility particularly intriguing. What if Neil saw Anika not as someone attempting to recreate the past, but as someone helping carry the music into the future? Suddenly, this imaginary meeting becomes less about comparison and more about continuation, not replacing a legend, not competing with a legend, but helping keep the music alive. And when you look at the reactions of Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, that idea starts to make a lot of sense. Because the qualities they praise in Anika may reveal exactly why this partnership works so well. And in the next part, we'll examine the strongest evidence yet for why Neil Peart might have genuinely appreciated what Anika Nilles brings to Rush's music.